Welcome to Design As, a show that's intended to speculate on the future of design from a range of different perspectives. And this season, like everyone else, we're talking about AI. I'm Lee Moreau, founding director of Other Tomorrows and professor at Northeastern University. This past May, I attended the Shapeshift Summit at the Institute of Design in Chicago, where designers and technologists came together to try to get a handle on what responsible AI is and what it could be. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the space between creation and consumption. This is a roundtable in 3 parts. On this episode, you'll hear from Anamitra Deb.
One of the areas we work on is broadening that table. Who speaks for technology? How do we play a part in being the protagonist in a technological future? And how do we bring society to the table?
Jessica Meharry.
How can we reframe the design context or the situation in order to bring in issues with equity, with inclusivity, with bias right from the start? And so not just like an add-on checklist at the end.
And Ann H. Barry.
We know design is not neutral. Technology is not neutral either.
In this episode, we're going to be talking in the space between creation and consumption, that tension. And what I'm thinking we should talk about here is a little bit of an academic framing. It's about school. It's about how we teach, how we judge, how those things work together and help to make us better designers. It's really that interrelationship between making and consuming that's always been part of the design process. We get a sense that technology can sometimes blur the lines between making and consuming, allowing some people to become more empowered creators, even when they don't have specific technical knowledge or tools or even a design degree. They're able to do more with the technology that's available to them. In many ways, that's a democratization of our craft and of our discipline, and that's wonderful. But the question also is, who does AI leave behind in this process? Who gets left out? And some of that are going to be us, people in the design community that don't feel like they have a place, don't feel like they can contribute. But there's probably a lot of other people who don't self-identify as designers who also won't be able to adapt to these tools. And that'll be a challenge that we face in the future. Let's hear some more from the speakers at Shapeshift on this topic. I'm here with Anamitra Deb at the Institute of Design. It's Thursday, May 29th. Hi, Anamitra.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Anamitra, thank you for being with us. I'd love for you to actually introduce yourself.
I work at Omidyar Network, which is a organization started by Pierre and Pam Omidyar, who were part of the Giving Pledge, to really dedicate a big part of their fortune while they were alive to causes that would serve humanity. Omidyar Network is our flagship organization, and for a long time we've done various things. Sometimes we've done a lot of work in advancing impact investing in the world, which was this idea that you could have a double bottom line way of thinking about marrying, sort of the market with social good. We've worked in various different areas, whether it's fintech or ed tech or consumer tech or other ways in which technology can really play a productive part in human empowerment and societal flourishing. And currently we focus on sort of hardwiring humanity into our digital future. That's kind of our tagline. And the reason we say that is because we think that technology in and of itself can make wondrous things possible, but it requires a shaping hand. It requires a guiding hand from intentional societal choices and from people, using their agency and their collective power and intelligence to guide humanity and to guide technology in the service of humanity. So our sort of the thing we think about these days is just that we want technology to be in service to humanity and not the other way around.
Sort of paraphrasing a little bit what we were saying, you used the words power, prosperity, and possibility, which seems a little bit like a tagline, but very much embedded in everything you said, as a foundation. How is the framing of that being used to mobilize internal resources as you confront some of the topics we'll be discussing at this summit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we do as a philanthropy is we have programmatic sort of grant-making areas. We roughly divide that into 2 types of things. One is what will increase shared agency among society to actually tackle technological challenges and improve our technological future. And that can mean a couple of things. That can mean sort of how do we think about responsible innovation that puts people first? That can mean how do we broaden the set of people whose voices speak for technology. I think we've come to a point in society where technology is so ubiquitous. It's in your cars, it's in your homes, it's in your relationships. There's really no way of ignoring it. Whether you have pets or children, they're using technology in some way or the other. We just listened to someone downstairs talking about Waymo. My father, who's 82, rode in a Waymo in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago when he was visiting, and he loved it. I mean, it was completely otherworldly experience for him. I don't think he could have imagined that 60 years ago when he was, a young man. But, these are the things we can do. But it requires us to think about collective choices. It requires us to think about shared agency. It requires us to think about how we expand the definition of expertise to include a lot of disciplines, areas, and human experiences that weren't always part of technological expertise, right? So one of the areas we work on is broadening that table. Who speaks for technology? How do we play a part in being the protagonist in a technological future? And how do we bring society to the table? So that's a big area of sort of how we work. The second big area of how we work is talking about societal governance. So some of this stuff is about codes, about design norms, about regulations, about rules. There is a process in which over time for every industry, we've set rules, and those rules have been to ensure that we have transparency and disclosure, to ensure we have consumer protection and liability, to ensure that ultimately the industry is working to promote the greatest good for the society that it serves. So whether that's the food industry, whether that's the pharmaceutical industry, whether that's the transport industry, and now it's the digital technology industry. And the digital technology industry has kind of got a free pass for the last 30 years. In some ways, it's the last unregulated kind of Wild West in America. And so one of the things we do is we promote a lot of civil society work, advocacy and policy and regulatory work to make sure that we are setting the right standards, we're creating new norms, and we're helping policymakers and regulators actually guide and shape, in the same way that we shape markets, that we shape the technology so that it sits in the public interest. So those are sort of our two main lungs, as we call it.
As you were speaking, you said a phrase, and I'm just a little snippet here, who speaks for technology? And then you kind of flipped it, and it's almost like you're saying in terms of regulation and rules, who speaks to technology? And a lot of that is about conversation, right? So how are you, and within those two kind of main platforms, so much of that is about bringing people into conversation. Who do you talk with most frequently? Like as you're kind of building the dialogue, who do you look to, outside of Omidyar to engage with?
Yeah. We work in two main ways, right? We work to fund organizations that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this front. So sometimes there are organizations that are building larger coalitions. At this point in the AI game, for instance, there's a lot of concern about what it will do with automation for jobs. And there are futures predicted where it will augment human productivity, and there are futures predicted where it will replace human capacity and productivity. And we're on the side of trying to make it sure that it is, what we say, cranes, not looms. And what that means is you want augmentation technology. Cranes do things. They help us to build the skyscrapers that are around us in Chicago here in ways that we could never build on our own. Looms, on the other hand, were replacement technologies, right? They led to vast-scale automation and disruptions in labor forces. And we've seen that history take place again and again. Ultimately, I think in the medium and long term, we are believers that productivity is increased and jobs are increased through the use of technology, but it has to be intentional, and we have to think about the disruptions. So as an example, when we think about who speaks to and for technology these days, having the worker voice in corporate boardrooms, having the worker voice in the decisions that are made about what technology is used to either replace them or to augment them, how the productivity that is created is shared, is really important. So as an example, the Hollywood Screen Actors Guild last year was an amazing example of actually using bargaining power to make sure that there would be a certain negotiated agreement on how the technology would be used, how the productivity would be constrained or enabled, and where the gains from that productivity would flow. And I think that's the really important piece of this, is when we broaden the table, we bring to bear new voices. So sometimes it's workers and labor. We've had a lot of success in the last few years by bringing kids and teens and parents to the discussion about online trust and safety. Some of the biggest beneficiaries of our internet experience and our technological experience today are kids and teens. I have, kids who are using the internet, who can use devices, and it really changes their lives in a way that we never had. I don't know how we would have got through the COVID pandemic without streaming video and audio, really.
Right.
Stuck at home.
Remote education and all
and remote
the
work and all the stuff
Yeah.
that we do today, right? And so that's amazing. At the same time, there's harm on the internet. There are dark experiences on the internet. There is predatory behavior on the internet. And some of that goes down to the responsibility that technology companies have in how they design the user experience. Sort of what are the values they're promoting? What do they allow and what do they disallow? And so a lot of the work we've been doing over the last few years is to advance organizations that speak for those values, that try to make responsible innovation sort of a core mainstay of the way that technology is designed, to try and change the defaults in the system, So for instance, a lot of work on exposing dark patterns and defaults. YouTube autoplay was a great example of something that for kids was turned off a few years ago. So kudos to YouTube for doing that, because that changed the way in which the engagement algorithms worked when they were, on YouTube Kids, for instance. This is because we've designed an internet over the last 5 or 7 years, especially where the real incentive is engagement, because the monetization engine is through ads. So everything that's been said about surveillance capitalism is about collecting data, tracking user behavior, serving them ads, and keeping them, having their attention hacked, having their attention stay on the internet as long as possible. It's led to a set of perverse incentives. And so a lot of the work that's been done by civil society, whether it's advocates that are talking about what research and evidence they have on these dark patterns or on these product design considerations, whether it's kids and teens and parents talking about the experiences they've had of harm, whether it's, as I said, workers and others, faith leaders, veterans talking about what happens when algorithmic decisions leave out certain communities. What we've learned over time is that if you don't broaden the table for who sees themselves working on and working with and working toward better technology futures, in dialogue with technology companies, in dialogue with policymakers, in dialogue with researchers and people who create evidence, and in dialogue with storytellers such as yourself that are, making these and putting these out in the world, you don't get the change that you seek. You don't get it if you only have engineers in the room, and you don't get it if you only have coders in the room, because some of these are not engineering problems. They are complex problems of what happens when we are creating social policy with competing values. And we have to design for both privacy and user empowerment. We have to design for both kids' online safety and the ability to scale products that are helpful. So a lot of this comes down to how do we sit and negotiate and engage in dialogue on these competing values. And what we do is we fund a lot of the groups, organizations, and coalitions that are driving those conversations.
So what I'm hearing is, this is a little messy. Dialogue is messy. Conversations are messy. We're here at the summit. You've come a long way. What are you hoping to hear? Things just started, but what are you hoping to hear while you're here for 2 days in these dialogues and conversations?
Yeah, what I'm hoping to hear is that people who are young today, especially, we are at a university. We're at a university focused on design. We're at a university focused on design for graduate students, which is pretty cool. That young people are really invested in making sure that they're not shying away from the complexity of how to make technology work for society. That they're actually invested in trying to figure out, what are the dark patterns and what are the defaults and which ones work and which ones don't. They're trying to figure out where can technology and engineering solutions really help, but where are they not fit for purpose? And where are there really actually complex human systems into which technology can be additive, but it can't be a replacement? It can't actually take the job of deciding for us what's democratically good or what content or speech should be allowed or how our relationships should be moderated. When I think about technology as replacements for our relationships, for our conversations, I think that's difficult. Those are really complex. We are complex. What I'm hoping to hear is that there's both an acknowledgement of what technology can make possible, which is really amazing, and there's an acknowledgement that it's a complex system into which we are placing new technologies. Those systems are human relationships and human societies. And if we don't have voices and we are hopefully going to hear from a lot of voices that say that that's important. That's what I'm hoping for.
The idea that human experience is both implicated in and also inflected by some of these technologies is, for me, as a designer, completely obvious. But it's important that we are making sure that that conversation is taking place in the development of some of this technology. We see a lot of conversation around the relationship between the developers, the deployers, and the end users of this tech. And there's just not as much conversation as there needs to be. So I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. Anamitra, thank you so much for spending time with us. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much.
I'm here with Jessica Meharry at the Institute of Design on Wednesday, May 28th. The event starts tomorrow. Hi, Jessica.
Hello.
Welcome. Jessica Meharry is a designer, researcher, and educator who develops justice-oriented design methodologies for professional practice. She's currently a visiting assistant professor at the Institute of Design at Illinois Tech, where she teaches graduate courses on developing more equitable and liberatory forms of design studies and practice. Now, that's one way of doing the introduction, Jessica. How would you introduce yourself if you were going to take us down that path?
Sure. I mean, I guess to distill it a little bit down, not quite so academic speak. Basically, I'm a designer and educator who's interested in how do we make products and services more equitable and just, and then helping other designers do the same thing.
Now, in a conference on AI, how might that apply?
As you might imagine, AI opens up even more things for us to consider when we think about, is something just or equitable? So we've been working a lot with students here at ID about what does it mean to work with AI as a new and completely new form of materiality, really. Like, it's not paper, it's not plastic, it's got all these other dimensions, even well beyond computers and internet and things like that. So we're really working on, like, what does it mean to use this? What are the other considerations we have to think about? Because as we all know, left unchecked, AI can really have some harmful outcomes.
As I was prepping for some of these conversations, you were one of the people that were highlighted as someone who's really using AI with students and in the classroom setting, which I think we talk a lot in academia about the impact of AI in education, but we don't always talk about using AI in education in a constructive way. Can you talk more about that and what your sort of vision is for that?
Sure. I'll just use a couple of examples. So one of the classes that I teach is actually a co-taught class with Politecnico di Milano, where we bring two cohorts of students together and we talk about AI and the futures of AI. So we do like a really intense workshop series, like, what are the different qualities of AI? What are the potential ramifications? What are the harms, the benefits? And then try to imagine some futures around that and then design around that. So it's really working through all these issues. And we've talked to all sorts of different industry speakers and experts in doing that. So I learn a ton, the students learn a ton, like, what are people doing right now? What needs to be considered? Like, this year's version was 2 months ago and it was all, we're designing for agents. Let's talk about agentic AI and what does that mean? And it can be really challenging. It's challenging for me, just like and it's challenging for students of what kind of career do I have now as a designer? Where do I fit? And, I just decided with some colleagues and as we were teaching, basically starting last year, let's just jump in. We can't sit back and say, like, you can't use AI. We're not going to do this. It's evil. It's bad. Let's get our hands in there. And so a second example is a course I co-taught with Tomoko Ichikawa, who's also a faculty member here, last spring, where it was 2 levels. It was a studio course where it was very open and we really just wanted students to explore all forms of generative AI. And we just kept logs and we shared tutorials and we just said, what's possible, what's not. Turns out a lot of things weren't possible. So that sort of felt a little bit better, like, oh, actually some of our strategic thinking and problem framing, this isn't going to do that for us, but here's some things it can do. And then the second level is we were looking at tensions in general AI more broadly. Like, what does it mean to use AI in healthcare? Many of our students are interested in designing for healthcare. Mm-hmm. What are the ramifications of that? What are the potential problems? privacy, bias, security. And so it's really interesting to work through that. I think it gave our students much more agency, like, oh, I think I know how to position myself with this, what I bring to this, what AI can do, versus we started the semester in a place of, I think all of us, a little bit more fear. And again, this was January 2024.
The vision I have in my head as you're describing it is that this may be a bit of a kind of creative free-for-all with all this Gen AI stuff. How do you bring the role of critique into the classroom, into the design school, as you're reflecting on some of the outputs?
Great question. So we are, number one, ask all of our students to be very transparent. When are you using it? When are you not? So like, at least we just know what is it doing, because part of what we talk about is discernment, I think, as it relates to critique, and the value of still knowing what it is possible in order to discern what the AI output is doing. And is that, first of all, is it truthful? Is it legitimate? Is it any good? Is it just speak? I don't even know. That's not a word, but
we can invent words all day long. That's fine.
And then actually in this class last year, I'm a big proponent of metacognition in teaching and having students reflect on their own creative processes. So we had them do that throughout the semester, where they were reflecting on when they were using Gen AI in the process and how that changed their design process. And then, being visual designers as we were, we had them create illustrations of this. And I think that was incredibly helpful too. So back to your question about critique, it's really being able to identify and being much more clear about what were your intentions, why did you stop at this point, what other paths could you have taken? And I think also that one layer of remove allows other students to come in a little better as well, versus just, I like it, I don't, but what if you used it this way? What if you used it that way?
I love your use of the word intentions, because I think we think a lot about intentionality in other forms of craft of design. But that's not something I hear a lot when we're thinking about like the newest bleeding edge technology. That gets lost. Where does that leave us?
I feel like my answer to a lot of questions is problem framing. As designers, that's where my work focuses on, is sort of how can we reframe the design context or the situation in order to bring in issues with equity, with inclusivity, with bias right from the start. And so not just like an add-on checklist at the end. So I guess back to this question of intentions, that's what I'm always working with students, like at the beginning, being very clear about that and being really clear that we as designers are not just neutral service providers. And if a client does want something, we can challenge that. We also have our own politics, meaning, broadly the word politics that we bring to a situation, and how does that affect what we think we're doing or not.
And of course, politics, when it's framed by what could be a 22-year-old design student, is going to be very particular and thinking about the future in ways that perhaps my generation is not so mindful of certain aspects of the future. How does that play out?
So I will refer to an assignment I have in another class. It's a class called Politics of Design. And the very first assignment is Politics of Me, which shout out to colleague Ames Hawkins, who helped me develop this assignment. But it's basically the very first thing. It's reflecting on your own identity, positionality, where you come from, your belief systems, your education, and to your point, generational differences. Because now so many things come in. I learned so much. So many of our students are from other countries. What are their backgrounds? I learn about bias in other countries or things, and I didn't even know that was existing. And then they learn about the United States context as well. So that kind of just helps sort of frame, like, you didn't all come in here the same. And so how does that shape who you are in a design context? When you have a client come in the room, which so much of our work is client-based, how do they see you? How do you see them? What are the dynamics?
On the creative side, if we move from the politics to the creative side, students surprise us all the time. I'm always surprised by students, like, wow, how'd you come up with that? And now we're using some of these new technology tools that accelerate how far work can be pushed. Can you talk about how that surprise changes when we sort of supercharge it? I'm using air quotes here, but like supercharge it with some of this new tech?
I think the supercharge, to your point, can speed it up a little too much sometimes. So an example, I'll use a class we just taught. It was that same studio class, but this spring again. And it was more open-ended. It was about design narrative and rhetoric. But students, I saw the supercharging in action, where they would come up with a concept and they were able to flesh out a narrative that was set in the 16th century, and it felt real, and there was a script and all these things that you would not have been able to do. And in some ways, that's really amazing. It's prototyping on sped up, but at the same time, let's back up. What are we trying to do here? How did this really develop? You were able to do it so quickly, conceptually, it might still not be built on a solid foundation. And so I think sometimes we kind of had to pull back a little bit, like, and realize they were just going to keep going. And we had to build in the brakes to question the concept and the problem framing as well.
Jessica, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a delight.
I'm here right now with Ann H. Berry, who's a practicing graphic designer, a writer, and an educator. She's also the director of design at the University of Illinois at Chicago, the UIC, which is just up the road.
Happy to be here.
And I wanted you to be part of this conversation because we've been talking a lot about AI here the last couple of days, and we've been hearing different conversations around what the implications will be for designers. Obviously, that takes us to education. We're here in a design school, but there are many different flavors of design school and types of design. I want to talk a little bit about the diversity of thought that we're bringing to the future that we're hoping to create.
Yeah, well, I mostly have a lot of questions. That's, I guess, what brings me to this conversation. Full disclosure, I have never used ChatGPT. I have never used a generative AI tool. So that might be a little bit different. And it might be helpful maybe because ChatGPT in particular, I know can be a very useful support for people, just to say a little bit about why I haven't used it. And that is, I'm a writer, and that becomes a topic that is in and of itself is really challenging these days in terms of the ways in which AI is picking up all of these things that we're publishing and writing. But I pride myself on my ability to write because I work really hard at it. And so, my tendency, my own thinking is, whether I'm writing a letter of recommendation or an email or a piece of writing that I'm going to publish, it all just comes from inside. So that's just gives you a little bit about my perspective and where I'm coming from on all of this. As an educator, this is certainly a very big topic. When I was transitioning between Cleveland State University, where I taught before coming to Chicago, so in between CSU and UIC, I was already having some of these conversations with my colleagues and even students about artificial intelligence. And I will say too, I think, ChatGPT is different than generative AI, but I tend to think of them as one lump thing, but I know that they're very different and potentially have very different impact. But we had students in our graphic design program at CSU who were coming to us asking, should I even major in this? Will I have a job? And I think I will say one of the weaknesses of not being more inquisitive about using ChatGPT, and I guess maybe I'm speaking for myself, is that when those questions started coming, I didn't know how to directly answer them.
How do you respond?
Yeah, I didn't really know how to respond to them. I think I tend to have this view of our profession of design because it's already closely aligned with technology, like design and technology are just connected. And because our discipline has been tied to technology and we found ways of evolving, the design profession is continually changing, that it just seems that we will find other ways to work around whatever these technological trends are. I guess, I don't know if it's fair for me to describe AI as a technology trend, but I guess that's how I think of it.
It feels very trendy right now. It may be a long-term thing that we have to confront, but it feels really hot and trendy and sexy right now.
It feels very hot, trendy, sexy. And I think I think part of what makes us so unique as designers is our creativity, the creativity that comes from inside, as opposed to even what we're making. We are makers too, but there's something about human interaction and communication that flows between people, particularly in the real world, that is still unique and special. And I hope that we always maintain that. But design as a profession, of course, has changed in many, many ways. So I guess my sort of default response when these questions would come up, questions and concerns, was, well, your creativity is the thing that makes you so valuable. And that is the thing that we're going to work to maintain. So I guess that was my response in the moment, but it did start me thinking, well, I need to educate myself a little bit more and be thinking about this more. So in fact, when I was interviewing at UIC, I talked about a couple areas that am hoping to have conversation around. One of them being new media and AI. because I also know that I have sort of limited knowledge and understanding of how these programs work, that I want to open up a conversation about it with faculty, because some of my faculty are experimenting using generative AI. Some of them are using ChatGPT. So I'm trying to approach it from, okay, what can I learn from some of these conversations?
I want to go back to the phrase that you said to that student, which was like, I want to help you maintain your creativity or to build your creativity, right? That's a two-way street.
Right.
As an educator, you know that. It's like, that's going to be an investment on the part of that student. It's also an investment on the part of you as an academic, the curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. That's a lot of responsibility.
It is, but I think, I've always felt that our job as educators is to really spark that interest in students so that it carries on, that they grab hold of something and that it motivates them beyond the classroom, because there's only so much we can do within a 2-year or 4-year program. We can't make people inherently curious, right? But we can try to find things, use the classroom as a way to inspire, as a catalyst. I think sometimes students underestimate the power that they have, or that underestimate their own abilities and what they can do with their design skills. So I sort of have thought about my role as an educator and trying to guide them in that way, or support them in that way, empower them in that way, as opposed to students being treated as just passive people in the room who are absorbing content. They have a role to play in the classroom. So that's partly also my approach to teaching, which I'm talking about, but I see education as a two-way street, absolutely. So what students pull from that and what they opt to take with them in their careers is up to them. But I hope that all of us as design educators are sort of opening windows and doors for the way students are thinking about themselves and their work.
And then we have to invite this other thing to the party. This AI is there. So we've got this exchange, this two-way street.
Yeah.
And then this other thing comes, new technology, which is always emerging and inflecting how we do what we do.
Yeah.
But that's there at the table too.
Right. Right. And I think, again, here, part of the challenge for me is that I think that, again, I talked earlier about how design and technology, we're just intrinsically, inherently linked, and we have been since our profession began. So that's not anything new, but I think I find myself more and more these days reflecting more on, as we think about this, the various technologies that have been developed and are continuing to develop, where is the ethical piece of the conversation? Because I think that's something that we as designers haven't necessarily done very well. Mm-hmm. We jump on, I'm speaking very generally here now, but we jump on new technologies. That I think that's, of course, what we do, right? How do we integrate these things into our workflows? How can this help us? How can this help the way we teach, the way we work? How can this push our own creative activity? But how often are we slowing down and stepping back just to ask, should I be doing this? So I guess that's also really the question that is bringing me to this conversation today is, should we be? Why do we seem to collectively automatically be all in on this thing? I think, I look at Adobe and, as the Creative Cloud, we're all updating our Creative Cloud, and now there are these AI tools that are just built into them, generative AI, and it does look great. There's so much amazing stuff you can do on the surface.
Dazzling, right?
Yeah. And it's I have seen some presentations that are really impressive. And of course, I understand what it feels like to then want to jump into your software and try some stuff, right? Because it's new tech. But again, it's this question of what is happening on the other side of all of this beyond what I'm seeing on my screen? What is the impact that I'm not seeing? From the limited that I know and understand, AI has this huge environmental cost. We don't necessarily see and hear or talk a lot about that, at least not in design circles, not that I'm aware of. So I'm where's that conversation happening? And then, of course, artists, are they getting credit for their work? It's just, I have a lot of questions. So I really wish that we could slow down a little bit And I'm not here to say no to AI, but like, let's at least slow down and ask ourselves, like, have some deep conversations before we just agree that because Adobe is putting it in our software and we don't have a choice about it, that we should be using it. I mean, Sam Altman is out there saying, you better teach AI, otherwise your students are going to be left behind. And I really take issue with that. Like, who is he to be sort of dictating
imposing
this?
that, yeah.
Yeah, especially to educators. I find that is one piece of this that I do find really offensive.
So you bring several things to the table, right? You talked about your writing, you're a creator, obviously as a graphic designer, couple decades of experience, not to like date you, but
that's fine.
You know, we probably buried the lead here with your introduction. And one of the things you're most well known for is as one of the editors of The Black Experience in Design,
yeah.
A really important book that came out approximately 5 years ago. Is that right?
2022.
2022. God,
It's 3 years
it's
old.
Only 3 years.
It feels like it's been like 10 years.
The Brick that came out, right? Which was a compendium. So I think part of this like questioning and wondering and trying to look back at where we came from and how we use the tools when we learn them is also part about bringing together multiple voices and trying to understand where we've been, right?
Right.
Before we go somewhere else.
Before we go somewhere else, there's a lot of work to do in that space, especially like given where the country is in this moment. It's, from my perspective, it is a signal that yeah, not only do we need to slow down, maybe we need to stop for a hot minute and really look at the profession. I mean, one of the things that worries me about AI and just technology in general is who it's leaving behind. You know, I think there's this notion that technology is neutral. I mean, we talk that way about design, and we know design is not neutral.
Right.
Technology is not neutral either. So what does that mean, that we're just willing to sort of accept these things that are being fed to us in a way? And we just, you know, we're so focused on moving forward, and yet there is a lot to sort of learn about where we've come from. When it comes to design history, there's just a lot that has been lost, and we're I think gaining ground in terms of our understanding that design history is much broader maybe than the way we've been talking about it traditionally. But I would say it's the same for technology and its influence, and who is getting left. That's the question. Who is getting left behind? And is there something we can learn about the past to help us think about how we want to approach these things in the future? And I'll just speak and say it, like, you know, I can't speak for all Black people, but as a Black person, I see the potential damage that all of these systems and technologies can do to really cause harm.
That's worth saying. I mean, this is not a conversation that we're spending a whole lot of time focused on, right? We are the dazzling, I think the words I used before were like sexy or whatever,
Yes.
like, you know, like, ooh, sparkly, wow,
Right.
fun, cool. Not this idea that this technology and design as well are not neutral should be part of this conversation. We are in a design school.
Right.
That should be part of the conversation.
That should be part of the conversation. And there is a tension too between design practice and design education. I mean, it's really interesting because these two things are so very much tied together, and we are like training students to be able to go out and work professionally. But at the same time, you know, educational systems, you know, bureaucracy moves very slowly sometimes. So we're not always up to date with what's happening in the, design practice end of the spectrum. But I think that's, you know, largely part of our goal in education, right? We want to make sure that our students, when they graduate, that they are qualified to like be in these roles and do these things. So I think that sometimes adds, you know, if things are really happening in the space of professional design work, then there's pressure for us as educators to make sure that we're training students in these ways with these skill sets. So if everybody's in the professional world, I shouldn't say everybody, but if there's, you know, people are using AI, generative AI, chat GPT, whatever it is, then there's a pressure on us, I think, as educators to also be doing these things to make sure that, that our students have the skill sets and blah, blah, blah. So I think that's another area where more conversation maybe needs to happen, how these two are influencing one another. And, you know, we want, again, our students to be prepared, but prepared for what? And this goes back to then the point about like, what is it that makes designers so valuable?
This is not necessarily a time where the concept of hope comes to mind a whole lot right now, May 2025. But what makes you hopeful? You've just, within the last year, taken this new role. You're leading, big responsibility.
Yeah.
You're looking beyond just the feet in front of you. You've got to have some vision there. What does give you hope right now, if I dare ask you that question?
Well, I think, what give me a minute to sort of think about how I want to say this.
It might be an impossible question to answer.
No, I think there is hope. I mean, so I think one thing I think about when I think about the future is futurism, Afrofuturism in particular, and these areas of design that are calling us to think about the world that we want to create, the world that we want to live in, and the power of imagination. I recently read Ruha Benjamin's Imagination and Manifesto, and it's a book that I return to now and again, just because I think it has this beautiful balance of, this is kind of where we are now, and there are challenges and acknowledging them, but also reminding us that we need to stay focused too on what the future looks like, and that we do have a hand in it. We do have some power. I tend to be a pessimist in the sense that I feel like, things become inevitable and we don't really have any options, but that's really not true. And I think maybe that is also one of the reasons why I enjoy teaching, because it I don't want to say forces a kind of hope, but it generates a kind of hope, at least for me, as I'm looking at the work students are doing, looking at the questions that they're interested in, looking at the ways they're thinking about technology can also be really inspiring. So it's not as though, technology is bad, but I think it's just like, let's be more reflective about our practice. Maybe that's the big sort of message that that's been the theme
this whole time. Yeah.
Let's slow down. Let's be more reflective. Let's have more conversations. I mean, not to poo-poo human-centered design. I mean, yes, we should be thinking about the people that we're designing for, but I think there's a way in which sometimes these processes in design make us think that we are approaching design in a way that is really being thoughtful of who our audience is. And there's so much nuance when it comes to designing for other people. It's not just the people, it's the context in which they are living and working and being. And I think that's a place where, again, Black and brown people sometimes get left behind. And a particular kind of design process is not going to solve for that. I think slowing down, trying to really engage with people in the real world and engage with people that we're either designing for or designing with in a meaningful way, that has real power. I think for me, that's part of what's missing too in this conversation about AI. There's something like, is there a better way to, interface between technology and like being in the real world that, I don't want to say creates a compromise of sorts, but at least brings these conversations together, as opposed to like, you're either completely on board with it or you're not. And there's just there are a lot of things that are really beautiful about design that happen in a very analog sort of way. I mean, there's a lot of joy. So I don't know. Those are the kinds of things that give me hope.
There's risk when we gain something new, like a new technology. We also lose something. I mean, you prioritize, right? You can't do everything all the time. And so there is a risk of losing something. And this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Design As is a podcast from Design Observer. For transcript and show notes, you can visit our website at designobserver.com/designaz. You can always find Design As on any podcast catcher of your choice. And if you like this episode, please let us know. Write us a review, share it with a friend, and keep up with us on social media at Design Observer. Connecting with us online gives you a seat at this roundtable. Special thanks to the team at the Institute of Design, Kristen Geekin, Rick Cure, and Jean Cadet for access and recording. Thanks to Design Observer's editor-in-chief, Ellen McGirt, and the entire Design Observer team. This episode was mixed by Justin D. Wright of Seaplane Armada. Design As is produced by Adina Karp.